Will you start us off with the?
Hi, everybody. My name is Luke Mortensen, planner. I'll help you facilitate the Zoom portion of this afternoon's meeting. I'll work alongside Chair Gildai to facilitate as we move forward. A few items that you've heard before. This meeting is being recorded and will be broadcast on the city's YouTube channel. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats should go directly to me. If you have a question or issue, please let me know in the chat and we'll do our best to catch those as they come through. Unless you're participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This is helpful to the people in the room and it allows the active meeting participants to be seen large on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting if your camera is off. When you're participating, please remember to turn your video back on. If you have any trouble, send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chair Finkelstein.
Thank you so much. So this is our last meeting before the official release of the draft we'll continue to look at. And that will continue to look over the next couple months, but we've had a series of meetings with the neighbors, or at least our consultants have, and I think Gabby gets the lead today, right? So Gabby, why don't you walk us through where we're at?
Great. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah. Turn you up, yep.
Okay, let me go ahead and share. And Elizabeth will be joining us just a little bit late. And she also doesn't have much of a voice, so I'm helping her out today. Okay. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so for today, first and foremost, we want to walk through the review and adoption approach and schedule that was guided by feedback that we received from City Commission and that we presented to Planning Commission. Was that last week or two ago? And get your all's thoughts on it. I mean, it's pretty set in place, but we will try and work through more so topics that we think would make sense to talk about, especially with steering committee meetings, and kind of talk about how the two sets of meetings relate. And then we will do a recap of those neighborhood meetings that we were able to have, and we had really good participation in those. And then talk a little bit about the comments that we've received from the online draft. And then discuss some drafting options that we have related to this, official final draft coming out. If we want to make some specific changes about topics that we all have discussed before, but that you might have, that might need some extra thought based on what we've been hearing from the community. And then we will walk through next steps. So the approach to reviewing this final draft is to meet with the Planning Commission a total of 7 times. Those are throughout meetings July through September. So it does end up being about those 90 days that we've been hearing requested for members of the public to review, as well as you all, as well as the City Commission and Planning Commission, with the recommendations coming in late September from Planning Commission. So that essentially includes July 24th's Planning Commission meeting, and then the mid-month meeting of each August and September, which are in the mornings, but are going to be open for public comment. And then the regular meetings on the Monday and the Wednesday, and I have the exact dates on the next slide. And then in the meantime, this group will still be meeting. There will be a meeting in August and September. And so the public will be able to be adding their comments as they have been for the rest of the modules, as well as providing those public comments. So we do envision that at the August and September meeting, we'll be sharing some of the things that have been brought up at public comment or been discussed with Planning Commission. And then it moves to City Commission for a workshop in October, and then adoption in November. Does anyone have any basic questions about that approach?
Make one comment that I'm not sure how it'll affect anything, if it will, but those requests, some of those requesting 90 days, they want it from the date the draft is published, as opposed to some other time before, with what's out there right now. Want to be able to see what we call final.
And I think the other thing I would say is, for the steering committee, think of us, I think the best way I've had someone describe this to me, and I think it made sense, is think of us like the applicant. What's submitted tomorrow is the application. It's going to go to the planning commission. The planning commission is going to make its recommendation. And that, whatever the planning commission votes on, will come to the city commission. But we, as the applicant, as a steering committee, can stand up in that meeting and say, here's what we propose, here's what the planning commission did, city commission, take action. So we, as a steering committee, will have, that's why we're going to continue to meet, and we will make a kind of like a recommendation to the city commission, we as the steering committee, as well as whatever the planning commission did.
Do we, I don't remember the timeline for sure. Does the Steerco have a meeting after the planning commission's final recommendation?
They do,
September.
they do not.
Okay.
Her slide just
In
said,
theory, we can meet in October. In theory, we can meet in October, because there's gonna be a work session at the city commission in October. And it's not gonna be on the agenda until November.
Okay.
the question, will the steering committee recommendation be an up and down vote? How does that work?
We're gonna talk about that at the end.
Yeah.
But how that works. And so. Yeah, we have that, I think, one of the final slides is to talk a little bit about that, just how that might work.
Yes, we do have that.
Yeah. So at the moment, we've scheduled steering committees in July, August, and September. Whether or not we meet in October, we will decide as we get closer if you guys want to meet or how we want to do that. But at the moment, those are our scheduled meetings.
Very thorough public process.
Think so. Okay, go ahead, Gabby.
All right, so what you're looking at now was our proposed, we wanted to, knowing that we had 7 meetings, we wanted to break them up into, more digestible topics, especially for ones that seem to be the main points of conversation. So we're starting with the procedural content next week. And then you can see the rest we have planned, those August 26th and 28th. As you all know, the residential districts, uses, standards, kind of everything wrapped into residential is something that we've heard a lot about. And that is why we dedicated 2 of the regular planning commission meetings to those topics. And then opportunities to sort of talk about the rest are in that last meeting as well. So as of the August 15th steering committee meeting, we'll have discussed procedures and mobility and connectivity. And then as of that September meeting, we will have tackled the residential as well as environmental and landscaping. Any
If there's
questions about
September
this or how
25th,
we decided this?
September 25th, wrap up. The idea, intention of that is that would be the time that the planning commission made the vote.
Yes.
want to put that word in there.
Yeah.
So people
Wrap up is.
expectations are set on what the
Yes.
intention is, yeah.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Debbie.
All right, so that was all for now on schedule. We do have some conversation at the end about how it will work for the steering committee to potentially make their recommendation versus planning commission recommendation. But we do have a few topics that came out of neighborhood meetings that we do want to get some more discussion with you all with in case we would like to make changes to the draft that's coming out. So we're going to run through the summary of those meetings first. And then after that summary, if anyone has any clarification questions, we can talk about that. So we did, we sent invites to all of the neighborhoods via the email distribution list from the neighborhood associations. We scheduled meetings for about 30 minutes each. And we ended up doing 11 in-person meetings on the 8th and 9th. And then we did 3 virtual meetings on this past Tuesday. So we got a decent variety, though I will say there were a lot of the neighborhoods close to the campus, surrounding the campus. But we really enjoyed talking to all of the different groups. And I should highlight that technically one of the groups we talked to was LAN as well as the individual neighborhoods. We didn't do a formal presentation. We really just said, come on in and tell us your key issues or your key concerns or ask questions. So it facilitated some good discussion and some good learning. So starting what we heard, related to this residential topic, this residential kind of umbrella that came about. There is concern about eliminating particularly the residential parking minimums across the board. Some of the things, concerns that were brought up were the impact it would have on street parking, including that general availability for either residents or the visitors to park near the place they're going. There was some concern about the safety for emergency and transit access, especially in more narrow streets. If there's 2 sides parked with cars, then it might be challenging for either a bus or a fire truck to make it through. And then also, we did have a lot of back and forth about the potential for the city parking permit process that's being explored. But there is some thought that if it's not in place currently, we don't know how comfortable we are. It's not appropriate for all neighborhoods. It won't be a solution for all neighborhoods. So the point of trying not to just consistently say, don't worry about eliminating residential parking minimums, we'll have this permit process when it's still in the works. So I heard some concern about that. Also related, concern about the increasing occupancy limits to 5 unrelated occupants. So in some districts, it would be moving from 3 to 5, and other would be moving from 4 to 5. There's concern about existing enforcement issues could worsen, and then it could further exacerbate the potential parking issues that are of concern with eliminating the parking minimums.
Gabby, if you click into that, was that really specifically about college rentals?
Yes.
Really where it comes from?
Yes, a lot of it was centered around student housing.
We had a conversation at the Planning Commission about the nature of today's family not being as traditional as it once was, and the idea of who's a family and who's not is a little bit more of a question. I wonder if there's a way to think about that different than the traditional family description and really focus in on the problem that we have, and that is in some areas where college student rentals is the problem.
Yeah, and I'll highlight that we did remove the definition of family. But I think the big thing we heard was actually specific also to number of bedrooms. So 5 bedrooms really bumps up like enforcement issues, and you really start feeling the impact of that occupancy level. But in the code itself, we don't have a definition of family anymore for that reason. It's just the 5 unrelated, as well as any of their dependents. But I think we kind of heard a little bit more comfort with 4. It's from the people that we talked to. I wouldn't say that that's a completely shared sentiment, but that did seem more comfortable than 5.
Thank you.
Okay. And we can come back to these in our conversation. These topics are some of the things that we're gonna ask you more about too. There was concern about duplex development, and it was from a few different angles. So there was this sort of combination factor of the proposed increase in occupancy could then increase speculative development of student housing in duplexes because you can now fit even more people in them. The point was brought up that currently only duplex conversions are recommended to have the provision to keep parking. But it was brought up that why wouldn't that apply to new duplexes? And how would that affect sort of creating an accidental sort of incentive for taking down single family to build a very large duplex, particularly for student housing. And then again, contributes or exacerbates to that parking issue. We heard some concern about the golf course redevelopment at Alvamar 9, particularly the loss of use of the golf course, and then the potential impact of residential development on the existing neighborhood based on moving to that R2 zoning. Also related to residential, we did hear about a concern that increased density will be concentrated in certain neighborhoods based on sort of existing development patterns and existing lot sizes and districts. And we had a discussion about the intent of keeping the R1 district and if it aligns with the city's goal to encourage density. And then also related is some concern about younger generations getting priced out of the market, and the potential of opening up more opportunities for adaptive reuse of non-residential structures for housing, as well as a desire to incentivize home ownership. I think that's all on residential. I'll pause here in case anyone wants any clarification or some more information about some of these.
Questions? These are things I've been hearing too, so.
I could offer as the Lawrence Association of Neighborhood Rep, a couple of these things really strike us well. For instance, the question about retaining minimum parking requirements for residential uses. Last night, LAN took an official position for that to maintain the parking minimums for residential uses, or particularly the older neighborhoods.
We have a couple specific slides on that in a second.
And the other part about this here, the intent of the R1 district to encourage density. At the July 9th LAN meeting with the consultant, that was discussed, but more importantly, emphasized, and it was a very lively discussion with LAN, the lack of the R1 district having mixed use. It wasn't so much achieving density as it was not having mixed use other than maybe an occasional duplex. R1 does not have a possibility of triplex or quadplex right now. And for all 8 residential districts to be equitable, they all 8 should have that level of mixed use, distinct from achieving density. We don't want the density to be all homogeneous, large lot, single dwelling. We want, it could be single dwelling, but we want a mix of uses and sizes. And so I just want that distinction understood.
Great, that's helpful. I'll move us into what we heard related to commercial issues. We didn't really hear, honestly, a lot, but it makes sense because they were neighborhood focused meetings. But we did hear again the concern about this combination of if we're allowing more mixed use, as in mixed residential and non-residential uses versus mixed housing types. In conjunction with this elimination of parking requirements for all those uses, if none of the commercial uses are providing parking, will that compete with nearby residential parking and on-street parking? And then also just a general concern and some questions about how the code addresses controlling the scale or the mass of non-residential or commercial development that are adjacent to or very close to lower density residential neighborhoods. So things like setbacks or limits to the building and impervious surface coverage. Another big topic was floodplain and stormwater. There was a desire to prohibit residential and commercial development in the special flood hazard area. And this has been brought up also at some other planning commission meetings. There was a desire to require a public hearing or a process for floodplain development permits, as in a public process. Right now, it's an administrative process. And then there was shared general concern in various areas of the city about how stormwater, stream buffer, floodplain, and drainage impacts are reviewed for during the development process. Procedural specific. We got a request to consider increasing the appeal period for administrative decisions from 9 days to 14 days. I mean, I think that we got a request to increase it, and with one group, 14 days seemed a reasonable middle ground there. That's where 14 came from. There was concern about the fact that by right development, which is increasing in particular related to things like duplexes in residential districts where they're not currently allowed, wouldn't include adequate public notice that neighbors would want just via the posted sign on the property. The mailed notice to property owners within 400 feet isn't required until you're doing 3 or more units with a site plan. So there was some concern there. And then also that neighbors should receive notice when waivers have been granted within a development. If a development had adjustments or modifications to what are typically normal standards, some notice that happened. So that is everything we heard. And so our next slides are walking through some of those common topics that we think could warrant some more discussion with you all before we get this next draft out.
I would just note on the procedure, maybe Michael would say this, I did receive a letter from Land about the meeting last night. One was, they said the 2 big issues basically were Land does not support elimination of parking, which requirements in residential neighborhoods. And then 2 is that there should be a mandatory neighborhood meeting for all rezoning, special use permits, text amendments brought by developers, major site plans and preliminary development plans. So expanding the mandatory developer meetings, which I think currently are only in the special use permit and preliminary development plans, I think. But
I think that's right.
I think that's what, so they're asking for that to be expanded. Were the two things they put in the letter to us from the meeting last night. Okay, with that, I know we were going to talk specifically about parking here. Elizabeth, welcome.
Excuse me, thank you. It's good to be with you guys tonight. Sorry about my voice. So let's jump into some options. And we know that we've touched on this issue with the steering committee previously, and don't know if you are of a mind to change where the draft is going, but we wanted to put some options out there for your discussion. We hear the duplex parking and occupancy question as a single concern about student housing development, particularly going into neighborhoods around KU. Excuse me. So some options for steering committee to discuss. And this is not all of it. You guys may have options that you'd want to throw out there too. But first off is leaving the draft as it is. Those pieces are in place to implement Plan 2040, and they all serve useful purposes as the group has discussed. Second option would be potentially to limit the overall amount of duplex development allowed per block. So, you know, that would be picking winners and losers, whoever comes in first, or if there are already duplexes on the block, saying that the entire block cannot convert to duplex, cannot convert to student housing, with keeping an eye on keeping the neighborhood intact. A third option would be to add back in minimum off-street parking requirements for duplexes or attached units. And we have another parking slide coming in also, so we'll talk about that in a second. A fourth option would be to map the neighborhoods adjacent to KU where it seems like these changes might be pushed hardest to the detriment of the neighborhood, and then potentially do the amount of duplexes per block or the minimum parking requirement in those neighborhoods only. And then 5 is other, which other members of the steering committee might have to throw out there. So we don't necessarily have a recommendation for the group. We know where the group has been in the past. And we know that, you know, we're hearing from LAN and a number of neighborhoods that these are their concerns. And as Gabby pointed out early, many of the neighborhoods we're hearing from are right next to the university. So we're not sure that this is something that needs to be expanded across the city, but we wanted to let you guys have that discussion.
Hey, Elizabeth or Gabby, could you refresh my memory? Do we have a definition or a specific section defining what student housing development is? I mean, is this a specific slice that is definable, identifiable on a map? How does that work?
We
No.
have not identified student housing on purpose. It's not always student housing. So, you know, we are treating all duplexes the same. What we're hearing from the neighborhoods is that the duplexes, the 5-bedroom duplexes seem to be the problem.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just going to your first paragraph that says single concern about student housing development. And so I'm trying to get my mind around what.
Yeah, that's my characterization.
Okay, okay,
Characterization of the concern being brought up.
got it, got it.
And that it's always students living there.
I mean, many of the neighborhoods, as we've talked about before, you know, let's pick a neighborhood in West Lawrence, they're not as concerned about parking problems.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, but I'm just trying to define.
No, that's how, yeah, that's just how to address the concern. Let's look at the next slide, Elizabeth, because I think they're related, and then come back to this one.
Sure. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks, Gabby.
Before we do, could I If we,
Well, this is related to parking, so I want to talk about this and come back and talk about parking in general.
okay,
Okay, if I go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay, so what we heard from the neighborhood groups were that the parking concerns are discussed in context with not believing that there will be sufficient parking options if the city doesn't require parking. And some skepticism about the city's ability to put permit parking in place, particularly because at some point along the way, somebody heard that it won't be until 2025 that the city's able to put permit parking in place. So that information had spread through many of the neighborhood groups that we spoke with. First thing on the left of this slide, we are researching parking outcomes in college communities that have eliminated parking requirements. I'm sorry, you guys good? Am I cutting out?
You're good.
Okay, sorry about that. So we hope to have that research available for you. We'll just email it out to the steering committee, hopefully in the next 2 weeks. We've just started working on that. Our goal is to speak to planners in these communities to understand the outcome and if there were any lessons learned from making that change. So potential changes in terms of parking are A, leaving the draft as it is, or 1, leaving the draft as it is, no change. 2, add back a residential parking minimum, and that could be applicable across the city or in certain locations. 3 would be to phase out the parking requirement over time, potentially in conjunction with phasing in the permit parking. And 4 would be to use a parking study for an individual, site by site or case by case basis to determine if off-street on-site parking should be required. So it could be triggered by a development of a specific size. So it could be, 5 units triggers it, or a total of 10 bedrooms triggers it. And so that is the most specific approach to it. If the city wants to target where parking is needed. But I would have to say that also adds a cost requirement to development because they would all need to add on a parking study. So those were the 2 categories where we wanted to double check with the steering committee that the draft is doing what you wanted to do, or see if you have guidance for changes that we should be looking at making in the next 24 hours.
yeah, let's go back to the slide before, and then Michael, so anyway, you can see how those are related. You could fix them or, how they're tied together, but get all those options out there.
thank you. Well, number 3 there, no, that's not the previous.
Go
slide.
back to the previous slide, please.
If we keep the minimum parking requirement for residential uses, then that would cover the duplex situation automatically. So we answer that question depending on if we go with retaining minimum parking for residential. So I think we should address that first.
And let me ask this question in relation. Our minimum off-street parking as it exists today is 1 parking spot per bedroom? Correct? Lucas shaking his head, yes, so
For
thank you.
any use or duplex,
For multifamily.
Multifamily,
multifamily.
yeah, not obviously for a single family home, but for a duplex up, you do that.
Okay.
So I think one caveat or one variation I've also had people talk to me about is, what if it's, 0.5 a bedroom or 0.75 a bedroom,
Mhm.
not 1 a bedroom. So you have a minimum parking requirement, but it's not the same minimum parking, 5 bedroom requires, 4 parking spots, not 5. Some equivalent. So again, that's kind of a variation off number 3 there. Going back to the 1 per bedroom, or do you do some variation? Again, current draft says 0 required.
We talked a little bit about a couple of different ways to approach that, and rather than 1 per bedroom, shifting to the idea of 1 per unit. kind of moves you towards, moves you away from parking, but still recognizes the need for that. If you convert a home into a duplex, you all of a sudden have a need for two off-street parking spaces.
So that's now a variation as well.
And do it by unit as opposed to a fraction of that. I personally don't think we try to solve parking by changes in how much we allow duplex development. I think those are two completely separate conversations personally.
You mean the 30%?
Yeah, or
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, I just don't think we solve this with that, but
I think that's particularly hard because we want to make development available to everyone. And if we say,
Yeah.
once you get to this limit, okay, no
Yeah.
more,
That's
Then-
key.
all of a sudden you're changing the rules
right.
for people.
The other thing that goes along with the idea of what we do with minimum is also to say out loud that we're not gonna have any requirements around commercial or industrial where those areas don't abut a residential street. I think we have to be conscious of where we eliminate parking requirements for a commercial organization, or it's right next to a neighborhood, and the impacts of that might be there, so.
So you're suggesting adding minimum off-street parking, but having it one per unit.
One per unit. That scales up and down depending on how many units you have. Maintain parking that exists today.
So that would be a change under the current rules. If you had a duplex with 2 bedrooms on each side, you'd have to have 4. This would say 2.
Correct. Off street.
Wait, that,
Brad, you have a question? No?
Yes. Yeah.
Could Marcy repeat her point?
But just, this was talking about limiting the amount of duplex development per
Yeah,
lot. It's always better if we establish rules that apply to everybody equally. So we don't say you get to decide. So the difficulty then becomes, what I think everybody is looking for is multi-use development. And how do you get that? If you say everyone can develop up to a particular density.
So do you mean multi-use or multi-dwelling?
Well, multi-use also would include multi-dwelling, right?
Yeah, well, unless it's just one dwelling and one other use. I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying, because
So
think both of my-
I think what we're trying to do is have rules that apply to everyone across the board.
Right.
And then that is what makes it very difficult to get what we want, which is a variety of options in a single district. So it's possible in those newly development areas where we say overall density has to be a certain density. And you can do this by combining townhouses, single-family dwellings. But when you say what you can do in existing neighborhoods, we don't want to just say some people can get an advantage and other people cannot. So how do we balance that to get where we really want to be in?
So we don't want to stop at 30%. No more duplex after 30%, because you're changing the rules as you
Yeah, you're saying the first people that got there,
first come, first serve.
but on the other hand, if you don't have that limit, do you want the whole neighborhood to become duplex? It's very interesting to me because I've been door knocking, so I've seen a lot of different
I'm not
neighborhoods.
saying that the question of max density isn't important. I just think it's a separate topic
Right.
from what should parking density be and how do we control that?
But they're tied.
They can be.
They can.
They're definitely tied. I mean, because the only way you get your density is you make your lots smaller and you push your house clear up to the front. You don't have any parking on on property. I mean, if we have a 10-foot front yard setback, you don't have any parking on your property, right? So 100% of your parking other than in a garage is going to be on the street. And that's the only way you're going to get anywhere close to the densities you talk about. And you're not going to get there anyway.
I think tying parking to density also assumes that everybody that's living in a unit has a car. And I don't know that that's true, particularly when we're talking about duplexes or triplexes. I mean, a lot of college students don't have a vehicle. A lot of people coming into that more entry-level price point housing don't necessarily have a car.
But we don't get to move the house and give them parking because of who moves in there,
Sure.
right? So, I mean, you got to provide the parking before you even know who the user is.
But I think that's the kind of problem, that's kind of moving target that makes something like a city permit process a more attractive option than just saying you have to have a certain number per unit, because the certain number per unit
Yeah.
might vary widely depending on who's living in the unit. I'm curious, Gabby or Elizabeth, if there was any more conversation in the neighborhood meetings about where the rumor about 2025 for a permit system came from, and if there's been any conversations with the parking department.
That came from the parking department.
Oh, it did? Okay.
I think Brad, I think Brad Harrell has said that's, unless we direct him otherwise, their plan is, now, we could tell them to move faster.
Yeah.
We, the city commission, could tell them to move faster, but their current proposal, the planning proposal is to have something ready by 2025.
Okay.
So that's not a rumor per se, what Jeff shaking said, right?
Okay.
Yeah, it's something in the word plan, just a matter of timing on that.
Okay. I was just curious where that came from.
If the city wanted to push it faster, it'd probably be, hiring some help to get it done, or, getting it done faster. It could be done, it just require more help.
I don't mean to be cynical, but that's the only way it's gonna get done, because this has been floating as an idea for at least 20 years.
Yeah.
And it never gets anywhere.
Yes.
So.
So I think that's where some of these ideas on that second slide came, which is, trying to, if you're going to go that way, tie them together. In the sense that, until we have the parking, I can see why someone's concerned to say, we're going to rely on a parking process that doesn't exist to control this. Let's tie those two together. If that's going to be our mechanism, let's tie them together. To me, that's fair.
I have a question for Bill. You said trying to achieve density if we have zero lot line in front. Is there a possibility of traditional neighborhood development with alleys that would accomplish that? So the parking is in the back.
Garages.
If you want to get above 4 units to the acre, the answer is no.
And we're talking about net.
No, we're talking about gross. We've had
Gross.
that conversation. We're talking about gross.
Yeah.
We're talking about gross density at 4 units to the acre, 4 to 6 units to the acre. I mean, the math doesn't work the way our tables are set up. And I think they're fixable, but the math just doesn't work, and if you go to R3, which is 7 units to the acre, which all our traditional duplex area transitions to, and you still have smaller front yard setbacks. I mean, I don't even know how. I think we just need to look at how the math between all those uses and the density all works, just to see that what we're proposing can actually work.
And getting back to the duplex question itself, duplex conversion could still have probability of space enough for parking.
Yeah, so that would have.
New duplex, maybe not.
Yeah, and my world is new construction.
Okay.
Yeah, in traditional neighborhoods, you're gonna have the 25-foot or whatever it is front yard setback, so you're gonna have a parking space or 2 parking spaces on property all the time. If we have to, on a new construction, try to hit 4 units to the acre, we're gonna have to go with 10-foot front yard setbacks, which means 100% of your additional parking is all gonna be on the street. None of it's gonna be on the property, because if I gotta shift it back 25 feet to get parking on the property, then there's no way we'll ever hit 4 units to the acre.
Well, unless there's other ways to hit it. in what you're perceiving, but if you put a four-story apartment building on the corner, followed by, so there's other ways of hitting it, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, but I mean, even with that, I mean, it just becomes I mean, it becomes a very complex.
Which I do think leads to two questions related. One, are we only talking about conversion of duplexes or, duplexes in existing neighborhoods as opposed to greenfield neighborhoods, residential? And we do have definitions of existing neighborhoods, right? So would these just apply there as opposed to a brand new one? Two, that number 4 there, is there any thought about limiting this to areas where we're concerned about KU, not necessarily just adjacent, but compared to students as opposed to West Lawrence or, farther away?
I believe on that point, I think based on what I hear at land and the conversations we've had, I think it behooves us to think that it's broader than just the immediate KU environs. Okay, the issues and the concerns about parking minimums are broader than just the immediate KU environs.
So another one I've heard, again, if you're thinking about that, is, some sort of phase-in process where the neighborhoods can choose. Like my neighborhood happens to be very close to KU, not adjacent, very close, but we have no parking problems. Because we have huge lots and we have lots of things. Pinckney is farther away from KU than my neighborhood, but they have more parking problems because they have more density, frankly,
Right.
than we have. So, I mean, another variation of that is to let neighborhoods select whether or not they want something like this, as opposed to making it apply citywide.
What would that process look like?
Yeah.
Houston did it with like votes.
Just by
Neighborhood votes.
neighborhood?
By time, within 90 days of the adoption of this, the neighborhood takes a vote and applies. I mean, I'm not saying that's what I want to do. I'm just saying it's
Yeah.
been done. Houston did it.
And it
And
could be changed, could be changed later. if-
And there's a concern, I know from some neighborhoods that landlords control a lot of the property. And so if you try to do a vote, the vote might not necessarily control what
Yeah.
the folks who live.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Brett.
Nick, did you have something you want to add?
Not anymore.
Okay.
It was,
So I'm interested in this.
Let's go quick.
Sure.
On the previous, I think it was a previous slide or the next slide, one of the two where you were talking about the parking study. Yeah. It seems to me like that MSO and PDS could be, as part of the administrative permitting process, could be charged with the responsibility of evaluating parking in a given infill development situation, that it doesn't require that the entrepreneur / developer front the money for a parking study, that the parking criteria that says, this is a good place for a duplex or a triplex. Okay, there's enough, they put a little bit of off-street parking, there's enough on-street parking available that this should go here fine. We can achieve greater density here. There's other situations where there's already 2 or 3 duplexes on the block and you want to add another one. Well, the parking in the immediate environs won't support it. But if you're going to do administrative permitting by right, then I think in part, unfortunately, the responsibility devolves to you and to MSO to develop a legitimate objective criteria that says this works or this doesn't work.
And again, my concern with that process is the nature of it. Like, you have a single family, like even my household, I've lived there for 18 years now. And for 6 of those years, I was parking cars on the street because my kids were there and they were driving. My first 12 years in the house, we only had 2 cars. Then we had a period of time where we had 4 cars, and now we have 0 cars. So back to kind of this thing, like, if not that my street has a parking problem, but a street can have a parking problem at one point and then not, and then have one again, and then have one again. That's why I'm not a big fan of parking studies. It's like the traffic study thing, like, you know,
But
you get so much.
in general, if
Yeah.
you're talking about denser form development and infill.
Yeah.
Most of it isn't going to be owner occupied, so you're building tenure form into that. With respect to duplex, triplex and quadplex. Okay, particularly if you don't separate out individual parcels in those duplex, triplex and quadplexes. Okay, so you're already building tenure into it, Brad.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, of those options, I would, if we're not gonna stick with no parking requirement, I would prefer some sort of minimum parking requirement to a study that may or may not, like, if they
Okay.
do the study in year 2, sorry, you can't build it. 3 years later, they do the study, oh, now you can have a duplex because the neighborhood's changed.
Okay, I guess I can see that.
That's my concern when you rely on the study that does that.
Okay, so a couple thoughts on parking as the designated transportation person
Mhm.
here. So generally speaking, in the transportation planning world, removing parking minimums is seen as taking down a barrier to developing both housing and commercial things at a lower cost. It reduces the amount of impervious surface by having fewer driveways with your garages. And it sort of encourages walkability in neighborhoods, which is a key cornerstone of Plan 2040. So there's a lot of good to be had. Are there problems? Sure. But a lot of the problems, I think, are perceived with people's worst case scenario of what could happen if 0 people change their behavior whatsoever. And maybe having never experienced what it looks like to have a fully parked street outside of maybe like a festival. So in cities that have far more people per square mile, yeah, you do end up having streets that are fully parked. What this means is that people do change their behavior over time. Some people will clear out their garages. That's been harboring clutter for the last 3 decades. Some will build a garage, some will build a driveway, some will expand their driveway. Some will go down to 1 car. Eventually kids will go out to school. Some may park a block over. I mean, having lived in Philadelphia for 5 years, sometimes you get lucky and it's right in front of your house. And sometimes, well, I guess you're 2 blocks away. You'll figure it out, right? And then on the other hand, having a fully parked street isn't necessarily a bad thing. I saw a public comment that was really concerned about like emergency vehicles and transit and stuff like that. First of all, on a lot of the smaller residential streets where a lot of parking may happen on the street, these are not transit routes. We're not worried about that at all. Second of all, when it comes to emergency vehicles, the width of the street is still such that a truck can get down. It's still up to NFPA code. It's not technically out of code. It's only 20 feet as a minimum. So as long as you have a 20 minimum road, it's okay.
I'm gonna have to say we got neighborhoods where that won't work, period. Brook Creek, which is ditches. Menard, which is one of the main streets through Barker, which is ditches.
Mhm.
People don't park right at the edge. You can't park at the edge. And if you put cars on both sides of the street, or Johnson,
Mhm.
which is right behind me, cars on both sides,
If it can't be done,
it's absolutely no way a
Yeah.
fire truck is going down that. So
Okay.
trash trucks have trouble getting down that.
It's a safety issue, then you don't have to allow parking on both sides of the street.
Right. Problem solved. It's a sign. That's a pretty simple problem.
No, but if you say you're eliminating parking requirements.
Yeah.
Some of those houses don't have driveways either. So some people are already having to park on the street.
Okay.
And so we do have, you gotta look at this by areas too, because some of these streets aren't up to code. They aren't up to the current code. They aren't up to the current width of emergency vehicles or everything else. Because they're too old. So we have to have that
Okay. So
as a consideration for certain areas in the city.
So, I mean, if that's the case, that's MSO's jurisdiction. If there's a 15-foot wide street like Oregon Street over in East Lawrence, cars occasionally park there for special events, but it's generally not encouraged. If it becomes a problem, you put a sign up and you enforce it, and then you make sure that emergency vehicles have access at all times. This is done administratively all the time. It doesn't necessarily preclude the fact that we could at least reduce or maybe even eliminate parking requirements. The other thing I was about to say is that having cars parked off street, lining either side of the street, is free safety barriers from cars to everything else off the street. If I'm walking on a sidewalk, I would much rather have a barrier 2-ton vehicles lining the street than I would rather have just a flimsy curb and me. It also slows down cars due to visual narrowing of the street. Few people outside of race car drivers are going to be going full speed down a street that is pretty narrowly parked. So there are actual benefits to having cars on your street as well. And not just, oh, that's my spot, don't take my spot. It's the public domain, right? So, yeah.
I think generally I agree with the whole principle. What you're describing will work, except for these situations that Jim brought up, which is included in my neighborhood. The streets are 20 feet wide. But it's only, I think, 9.5 lane miles in the entire city. There are streets like that. It's not a whole lot of streets, so maybe we could craft it with some kind of an exception in those situations.
That's one of the things that has been floated since this started is having to look at specific developed areas as a general rule for the whole city just doesn't work for certain parts of our city anymore.
For a lot of those.
I mean, at some point, we have to realize that developers, though occasionally viewed as unscrupulous, are not idiots. If you're in North Lawrence and there's zero parking that can be done on the street legally with the fire truck to be able to pass, why would you ever build a place with no off-street parking in North Lawrence? That would be stupid. Nobody would do that. And if they did, it would sell to maybe a bicycle enthusiast or it wouldn't sell, like developers will figure it out. And if they don't, the market will teach them that is not how you build a property, right? We're not saying get rid of minimum off-street, we're not saying getting rid of off-street parking at all. We're saying, let the people figure out what is right for them. And use the public space that we have to its full extent, rather than just letting it languish and forcing everybody to subsidize off-street parking instead.
How does that fit with wanting to have more electric vehicles and more opportunities for charging stations? Because if you're gonna charge your vehicle, it needs to be in your garage, overnight.
In the US, in other countries that don't rely on single-family homes for everything, there are actual charging stations at places of work, commonly visited third places, and also in apartment buildings, public parking garages, gas stations, they're all over the place.
Okay. If you charge your car during the day, you are using more energy
At a higher rate,
at a higher rate.
yes.
So how do we encourage that overnight use at the same time? I mean, if we're not gonna have everybody who's parking on the street have a job that has a place where they go to work and have a charging station.
I mean, we don't really do anything about it now. It's a good time to think about it for sure, but I mean, it's already an issue, right? Like at this point, if you don't have a single family home, you are not getting electric car within reason, right? So yeah, it is an issue of kind of equity almost. As far as where to put the charging stations, yeah, I mean, public places would be great, but you do raise a great point about it does cost more to charge during the day. What's the solution? I don't know. But I do know that the solution is probably not making sure everywhere is parked as much as it possibly could be, and let's store all of our cars, because electric vehicles, though great at reducing tailpipe emissions, still run on carbon for the most part, right? Unless you're really savvy with your electric bill.
Yeah, you have to go into the SPP website and watch when this.
Okay, just one clarifying question. I was just thinking about Jim's comment about neighborhoods that are narrow streets or no driveways. This idea of one off-street parking spot per unit. Would that work in an area with, like you're describing?
I have no idea. I just know we got some areas with very narrow streets that have cars parked.
If you had that requirement, though, wouldn't that give some relief?
It's hard to predict
Not one side, but
And how would you do that if you're retrofitting after the fact? So you're coming in and putting in off-street parkings
Maybe.
at a later date.
It should,
Yeah.
good way.
I think what we need to decide is, well, what's gonna get released tomorrow? Do we want to leave it as it has been, which is no residential parking? We know what we're going to hear. And in the end, planning commission, eventually the city commission will have to decide. I mean, I've pushed for it all along because I wanted to see what people would say about it. And we now know what they say about it. Where we end up, obviously, but now I think we know where we're at. Land has a strong position on it. I think some of the neighborhoods along with land have strong positions on it. I think Nick is articulating, of course, one of the arguments where we've seen it done in other places, that you let the market figure it out. Do we want to make a change in the draft that comes out tomorrow? Or not, I think is the question.
So I'll be honest with you, as much as I favor eliminating minimum parking requirements for residential, it's true, we don't have a plan for what happens if things get bad. That's not great. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. I would personally go for option 3 because we really don't have a permanent parking plan. And I personally don't think permanent parking is even the right option. It's crude, it's old school, and it doesn't make great use of the public space at the right price. So I think there's work to be done on what that option is. And we're not even close to being there yet. So I think in the meantime, to assuage concerns of what the parkopolis might look like, maybe we should just leave it in for right now. We can maybe tone it down a little bit, like maybe 1 per dwelling unit instead of 1 per bedroom, which gets nuts, especially in student housing.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm okay with the compromise given the constraints and the prognosis for actual parking reform.
And how about existing versus new? Existing neighborhoods
Yeah.
versus new neighborhoods? I assume new neighborhoods, are you okay with no residential requirement in new neighborhoods?
I would be incredibly surprised if anybody gives no off-street parking in a new neighborhood of single family homes, but I don't know.
Well, I'm,
The land position.
well, what I think, I don't think anyone would build a neighborhood without that, but I think they could build a unit.
Yeah.
Or they could say out of the 50 structures I'm building, these couple don't have parking and the rest do.
Yeah.
This would give them the possibility, if we make a requirement that
Yeah.
applies to it, they have to put a parking spot.
Interesting.
I'd
Yeah.
love to support
Of
the idea that new development, that we allow for less parking. It's different from redevelopment.
I agree.
I would agree.
I agree.
The land position is for retaining the parking for existing neighborhoods. And one of the people at that discussion at LAN actually proposed this kind of phase out, that we change the numbers gradually over time. He didn't connect it with the permit parking question, but he did propose a change over time of the requirement to phase up.
That'd be interesting.
So what about, I'm throwing out there, 1 parking, per unit, 1 parking spot.
Yep.
Off-street parking per unit in existing neighborhoods, none in new neighborhoods.
And number 3.
With phase out to
Yeah.
the parking permit issue.
So 1 unit is a place to start, and that's a big change. So 1 as a place to start. The idea that we phase out over time
And removing it for commercial industrial is already a big change.
and in redevelopment.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't,
Well, yeah.
let's talk more about the commercial.
Yeah, well, let's pause before we get there.
Yeah.
Because I want to ask Elizabeth or Gabby, are they, do you need clarification on that? We're not done talking about it, but you want to make sure you understand what we're talking about there?
Yeah, I think
one
we
question-
want, sorry, go ahead,
Go ahead,
Elizabeth.
Gabby. No, go ahead.
For drafting purposes, I think we need a clear idea of what you see defined as existing versus new. If we're going to apply different requirements for
Don't
those.
we have a definition for the contact space?
They're talking about like redevelopment or infill.
Yes,
Okay,
as opposed to greenfield, as opposed to a greenfield development.
okay, that makes sense. We do have that.
But that was still under question. I mean, is a 5-acre site in town infill or greenfield?
Yeah. it's
Yeah.
greenfield.
Yeah, I think, I know, again, yeah, we could define it differently. I guess I was proposing that would still be under that definition. Well, I guess I asked
I
that
think-
question.
If the neighborhood exists as of the effective date of this code, it's existing.
Yeah.
If it's developed later, it's new.
So even if it's a 5-acre spot in the middle of Bulker neighborhood, that's still,
And Gary's one, or whoever's one space, it's 1 per bedroom now,
Yeah.
not 1 per unit.
1 per unit.
Yeah, that was the thing I wanted to clarify. Are we at 1 per unit? So a duplex would require 1 space for each unit, or are we at 1 per bedroom?
1 per unit.
Per unit.
Duplex would
Okay.
require 2.
Okay, thank you.
So
And
do we
what-
want to can make any considerations for close to campus? I mean, just because this does also connect with how many people per unit can live. So if you've got 5 people and you've got 10 people in a duplex and you're talking about 2 parking spaces. So it does make a difference depending on if it's where it is in the community.
And as a clarification, is this in addition to the enclosed garage? Or does the enclosed garage count?
That's an off-street parking.
That
space,
count.
right? So it counts.
Well, we're just talking parking spaces. That's why I'm trying to
Yeah,
clarify.
that's a parking space.
The enclosed garage counts. The question is, does the space in front of a enclosed garage count?
Is that your one space per unit?
The enclosed
driveway?
garage would be,
Post garage, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you don't have to provide anything other than a garage.
yeah.
So if somebody provided an enclosed garage and the lot were large enough that they did a driveway that away from the sidewalk has enough space to park a car, that could be 2 spaces.
Yeah.
Correct?
And I'm, of course,
No.
I'm thinking conversions, right? So if you have a garage to start with.
here's
you're
the
done.
problem. I mean, we don't want to say if you can't access the parking space without somebody else moving their car, then that becomes a problem. And this, I mean, in a student neighborhood, the last person who gets home may not be the first person who's leaving. So you don't want them behind another person who's trying to get their car out. Does that make any
I
sense?
remember being that person.
They ought to be able
And
to
is
work it
that
out.
something we have to regulate?
No. Design should help people get along, not create problems. So if you're a family, you can work it out. If you're roommates, it's sort of a different
So the
issue.
language
I don't know
would
that
be
it's our
one-
job to micromanage that.
Yeah, I'm sort of for letting.
Well, but why would a space behind another space count? That's what we're saying, because in our neighborhood, they're talking about, can you have double stacked parking?
It'd be a lot better for curb cuts than having side by side parking. And curb cuts is something that we'd rather not have.
We don't have curb cuts in our neighborhood because we have alleys.
Are you saying if there's a duplex with a single car garage, but with a driveway? I'm asking.
Right.
Would that be 2, or would that be 2 parking spots, or would that only be 1?
So could the language be one unobstructed off-street parking space per unit? Just add the word unobstructed.
Record.
Friendly amendment?
Friendly amendment.
We're gonna face this stuff out anyway, so.
Yeah.
I almost hate that, I almost hate that I'm asking this, but, you brought up an interesting point of like, does a garage count as parking space? In my mind, I'm like, oh, of course. But that being said, garages have gotten larger as trucks have gotten larger and the size has not necessarily kept pace. If you have an F-150 and you can't fit it in a garage, is that a parking spot? Does that mean that now, even though the developer was required to put a parking spot, that parking spot wasn't even good enough and now you have your truck on the street? I don't know.
Yeah, no, there's garages off the alleys that
Yeah.
haven't seen a car in years.
Yeah. The parts haven't been
And most of the garages in Oriat are used for storage, not.
Yeah, any store and
Most in the community.
But you count.
Right, and I think they should, because if things get bad enough, figure it out, be an adult, clear out your garage, make a space, if it's that much of a problem, figure it out, you know?
I feel like that language
Get your
gets us
roommate
down
out
the
of bed
road.
in the morning.
Gets us
Move your car.
down the road.
Okay,
Yeah, I
Um,
think we got
um,
that. Can you guys
okay.
talk about the phase out just a little bit more?
Wait,
Are
hold
we
on,
doing a
sorry.
phase out with this?
Before we get to phase out, what was the distinction you wanted between existing and new? New doesn't need any, or new needs more? I missed that. I got the 1 per unit, but to what does that apply and how does it differ?
New, there's no requirement. Greenfield,
Okay.
no requirement.
Okay, are we doing a phase out?
So yeah, let's talk about we're talking about the phase out. Tell me more about people who want.
I can't imagine the numbers. I would trust Elizabeth and Gabby as a professional.
But what are you talking about? Like,
Well, it's contingent on getting a parking permit, system going.
Yes.
If there's
So the
nothing
parking
else.
management system has to be in place before we
What
can
the
address
numbers
this.
are.
So once a parking permit system is in place, then none of the existing neighborhoods that have the parking permit system have any parking requirements. Is that what we're saying?
is that what you're talking about with the phase out?
I think so.
Can I ask you a question about permit parking? Is there gonna be enforcement? Is it gonna be complaint-based enforcement?
If there's enough revenue coming into the system, there better be. And if not, then it can't fund it, it can't fund itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where you worry about this is the commission and how good the program is. Man, I do think, I mean, one option is not to put a phase out with some trigger that we can't define.
Right.
And when we create it, the city commission can also change this parking requirement anytime that they want. And so I think I would probably not put a phase out at this point with some trigger that we can't really define. But know that, I think people are thinking about that, and I think as we work towards that, it has a lot of details to be worked out.
Absolutely.
And, in how you do it, how you enforce it and all that, but I guess I would.
I guess for somebody who already pays for a parking permit for downtown
Yeah.
and has experienced the enforcement of that, I'm struggling a little bit to understand what the problem would be in expanding that into existing neighborhoods.
Well, it all comes down to cost. You also, are we gonna have a parking permit system where everyone has to pay for a parking spot? $280 like you pay downtown, or is it free for people who live there, or does each house get two? And then you pay for anything above two? If you're giving away free spots, you can't, then enforcement becomes the general fund issue of hiring, people to go through all the neighborhoods and write tickets. Or do you fund it through ticket? Downtown, it's a $10 ticket. Do you fund it through a $75 ticket if people park illegally? I mean, that's where all those issues come in.
The last I knew, and I don't know how the new fine schedule works, but the last I heard was that the amount of meter proceeds, the amount of fines and all that wasn't enough to pay the enforcement officer. That ratio just didn't.
Pretty low cost.
We've done a little better now that we switched the system and
better.
raised the fees, so it's
Okay.
pretty much,
Because that
Someone
would
would
be
have to-
critical if we expand.
but yeah, so there's a whole lot of questions on how you do that.
That's it for us to solve here.
No, that's what I'm saying.
That's your problem.
That's what I'm saying.
Right, that's your problem. But another question is whether state law will allow
Yes.
just if you have to have police give the tickets outside of the downtown area, making it more expensive.
And state law is your problem.
And say-
Not- If you vote for me, it will.
Yes, that's issues on how you can enforce outside of downtown,
Yes.
and whether or not, can you do private thing versus a police officer having to do it. The police
Hey,
officers are obviously a lot more
That's why
expensive.
I'm gonna be there.
Okay, so no phase out, we'll make it easier on you at this point. Okay, commercial. You said you want to talk about.
Wait,
commercial
let's
first.
back up. Can we, Gabby, can you back up to the duplex slide? So does this mean that, so we've added back in a parking requirement? So we don't want to do a limitation on the duplex development in any way. We think this will address it, correct?
Yes.
And
Do
then,
we still have, are we still retaining the existing parking capacity for duplex conversion though? Which was in the
We have
last
not
month?
changed that. We are not gonna change that.
Okay.
and then the other issue that was adjacent to this, but came up is, and I don't think we actually have a specific slide about this, Elizabeth, but is if we want to do anything about changing or decreasing the proposed 5 unrelated occupancy.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's talk about commercial.
I want to get to administrative at some point.
Yep.
I think the question on commercial is, it may be a problem if we do not require any parking for commercial that is adjacent to a residential street. So do we want to limit the commercial development without parking requirements to intersections that are arterials? Because those don't have any possibility for affecting residential.
And would New Hampshire Street downtown be considered residential, for example? You know, 4-story high residences. How do we define it?
Well, that's residential parking and what residential parking is requiring.
But I mean, if it's next to something like that, would that apply?
Commercial, downtown is a specific district that right now doesn't require any parking, and that's been a good thing.
Yeah. So it could be a similar model.
Well,
Are we?
the issue with downtown is the community has established the parking, which would not happen in other areas. So I'm saying we have situations where there's commercial parking on a residential street. If you don't require any parking for that commercial development, is it fair for them to use all the residential parking?
Sort of said a different way, I think is,
Yeah.
the concern is about how does, where commercial parking meets residential parking, how do we protect unintended impacts on residential from removing any commercial?
See, I'm thinking about like R4, 32 units an acre, for example. I mean, do we want to limit commercial adjacent to that kind of residential? As opposed to single or duplex, triplex kind of neighborhoods?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out, are you concerned about commercial on a residential street or
I am concerned. about-
commercial on a arterial street that happens to have a residential street behind it?
I'm more concerned about commercial on a residential street. And we have examples of that.
Sure.
Yeah, say somebody wants to build something large commercial with a lot of people that on the Castle curve. They don't provide any parking, they don't provide adequate parking, what parking spill out into the neighborhoods around it, just as an example.
Yeah.
And I agree.
Is there some way that we can simply mitigate that risk? And one thought was, we'll say that if it's on an arterial or collector, that it's open, that there's no parking requirements.
Those are residential street.
But where it abuts a residential, then we look at it. Maybe that's what we look at that and make sure that there's some decision made as a part of the approval process.
Because I think the size of the commercial is again the variable here, right? What kind of parking impact what we're trying to incentivize as mixed, like small neighborhood commercial?
Yeah.
What kind of parking impact does that have? Which I'm hoping we can assume not nearly the same as a giant commercial. And then I wonder that question, or what Nick brought up earlier, like there's gonna be no giant commercial enterprise that doesn't provide parking, because how will they succeed commercially?
A commercial is already required parking based on square footage. So that's already a given.
I mean, that's today, but not with the.
Right, but this says you don't have to have any at all.
But I'm saying how smart is that?
Well, sure, but the question is though, just is there any need to protect unintended?
Yeah.
It's all about protecting residents.
No, I understand that, but our rule, it seems like it would vary depending on the commercial impact. And again, it's hard to say any commercial would need to provide this parking when we might be talking about very small commercial that fits great in the neighborhood and doesn't need a lot of parking spaces.
We already differentiate. And that's my understanding. We differentiate between the type, if it's neighborhood commercial, right? About the parking requirements. So can you develop a restaurant on, a commercial property on a residential street and not have to provide any parking? And what we did recently in our community was ask the members of the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association to rezone their properties to eliminate commercial. Not everybody did that. Right? So now we're going to reward some people and say, hey, no parking requirements. You can develop whatever you want. And I'll ask the city commission to take Ray's audio and make it commercial again. So it's just, should a commercial property be able to just use residential street parking for their business without any other accommodation?
Marcy, can I jump in and ask a question to Marcy? Sorry. So I think maybe where Rebecca was is that there are so many permutations of what could happen. Would it be worth it to the city to start with no parking requirement rather than solving problems that are a little theoretical at this point? And then at some point down the road, if that doesn't work, changing the parking requirements?
They're not theoretical, they've happened.
What about,
They are not theoretical.
what about,
I guess I'm saying theoretical for new development. Go ahead, sorry.
what about? I said I didn't like parking studies. I mean, what, to Rebecca's point, what about for commercial projects on residential streets, you have to do a parking study?
Yeah. And then,
Because that might make a difference on what the use is.
Or even simpler would be in an application for commercial use, they need to tell you how they came up with what they're parking. I mean,
there's no requirement, though. They could tell you what it was, but with no requirement. Is there any forcing function to make it different?
well, at least you know more than, once you get there. I mean, a parking study is, like a traffic study.
The number of commercial projects we'll have on residential streets
Are very small.
are very small. And if, so what about that? If it's on a residential street, you have to have a study.
But, I mean, if there's no criteria, it's the same, back to
Yeah.
Terry's point, if there's no
This-
criteria, what's it?
Oh, I see what your point. I see what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Well, when
Pay to
they-
study it if you don't have them require it.
Study, identify the parking demand, and then that would be what the city requires as part of the site plan approval?
Well, but that's what our parking requirements are, right?
Well, except, the problem is it's based upon square footage, or it's based upon, that's why we have so much number of whatever.
Type of use.
So again,
What was that suggestion?
she's saying, have you do a study,
Yeah.
and then the parking required is basically what the study is. The demand that the study comes up with,
Where it's residential?
if it's on a residential street.
Okay, so how expensive is a study and why is that better than setting a requirement?
Because you could end up with something that doesn't require, that you end up with what we have now, 5 or 6 parking spots that never get used. Because the commercial use doesn't require parking.
And it provides for things that are just outside of like a mainstream. Yes, it could be very little, it could be a lot, and that way it's gonna be enforced more precisely.
Depending on the use.
I think our rules should be developed more precisely. Because if you're a lot shop, you don't need parking for a lot of people, right?
I guess that's kind of the point. though,
If you're if you're
A restaurant.
restaurant,
Yeah.
you're gonna need more people at the same time.
I think though, if I'm understanding it right, this approach gets at that very thing.
That's exactly what the demand study would do.
Yeah.
By costing people who are asking for it more money, right?
But don't we have the parking tables now?
Go back to what
Yeah, parking, we have parking tables.
based on.
Hold up. So
Approving
a
based
parking
on different
study, parking study for something that small is probably gonna come in at about a couple grand. A parking space is worth about 15,000. It's worth it to not over park the commercial in residential.
So I think Marcy's question is, and, Jeff, maybe you can answer it, Becky, we have parking tables now. If we just left those on and said this applies only on residential streets, would that? I mean, one of the concerns is that our tables that exist now have created things with lots of extra parking that we don't need.
Yeah.
So then if we leave those tables in there, do we have to go in and change them all if we want? Or,
Table, then that's something.
so Jeff, yeah.
The table is based on use. So a restaurant will have a different parking use than an office space, which will have a different parking use than somebody else. So it would limit probably the potential of spaces to be reused. So you would be locking in a certain commercial function into that space in perpetuity potentially. So there would be, if you're parked at a certain ratio, that's great. If you're parked at a certain ratio, then you can't go above that if you ever needed to change it without going through a variance procedure or another step in the process there. So I understand the dynamic there. I just want to put it out there is that there is some back and forth in there that you want to be mindful of, is that if there is a place that is built and constructed with 2 parking spaces, it would never probably be able to exceed and go up. So you may have vacant commercial spaces because they do not have the ability to change their parking loads.
Variance is available.
But Phil mentioned earlier about, you know, the developer / entrepreneur says, you know, I come up with this number that we're gonna need 6 spaces. You know, and it may not fit with the table or anything like that, but that's what they think they need is 6 spaces. Then whose job is it to say, we think 6 spaces is great, or we don't think 6 spaces is enough? I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the administrative permitting function is to make that call? Or am I missing something here?
Well, that's if you, either right now we use it by table.
Right.
We don't make judgments, we tell them what the table is. I think the other option would be to have an administrative process where you do a study and they make a decision based upon the use. You know, and so I think that's the question. None at all on residential streets, use a table on residential streets, or use a study on residential streets.
But what Jeff seemed, if I understood Jeff correctly, he's saying you may be locking in function by
using the table.
By using the table, and I don't think you necessarily want to do that.
I thought you said by study.
Without overcomplicate, maybe you just have a path to both. By default, it's the table. Developer has an option to do a study which would override
I like that.
whatever the table says, and you don't have to go through the variance stuff. And you're there.
Sorry,
You
can
say-
say that again?
Use both. Starts with the table. If the table doesn't meet high or low what you think you need as a developer, you can opt to do a study. And if the study then produces what you're looking for as a business, then that's what becomes part of your plan.
I think you could play with those numbers pretty easily.
Well, you could, I mean,
But it's
studies
getting.
are valid or not,
Yeah.
right?
Right. It's giving a little more leeway.
You okay with that as a path?
Did you follow that, Elizabeth, that option?
Yep.
Okay.
So the change we'd have to make there is switch from a maximum parking requirement to a minimum parking requirement for commercial on a residential street.
Yes. And we just made our
Yep.
code longer by putting back in some tables. So we take it down.
Okay.
So the question I would have there is, the commercial use list is pretty long. Are we wanting to bring back as the minimum what the code says now? Or reduce those, or?
Well, I think what we're saying is for the moment, leave what's in there now, but that you could use the study to opt out of that number. But I think in the next couple months, we can look at those numbers too, but for the purposes of tomorrow, you would be, put it in as it exists. With an option to vary based upon the study.
put the minimums in as they exist.
Yeah.
Okay.
On residential.
On residential streets only.
So something that may come up, that has come up in other cities that have been grappling with growth and changing constraints, is that when you require parking of even the smallest businesses with even the lowest commercial traffic, you end up getting in these crazy situations where a business who has the money and is ready to expand has been told, you need to have, 3 parking spots, and there just literally is no place on the lot that they had planned on to have it. So what do? They buy a house on the same street, either next door or down the street, they knock it down and they make a parking lot. This is the situation in a lot of towns across the country. That's kind of the route we're heading down if it gets to this point. If all of a sudden we can have walkable neighborhoods with commercial that is scaled to the neighborhood itself, that's, at things like they used to be in the good old days, right? Like small grocery stores, small bookstores, things that are great and people like and are amenities. Just because of the carpocalypse imagined scenario that we might have tons of cars parking at the tattoo shop downstairs or at the taco store that only has 2 seats at the counter.
Tuesday.
Instead, we're going to end up with having to have required parking places that may not have enough on their lot, and therefore we'll probably have to purchase other property, knock it down and make it work, or we'll never start to open up at all. So how many businesses are we going to squash before they even get to the concept design phase, just because we were worried about not being able to use the free public parking space in front of our homes at all times? It just seems like kind of a little blowing out of proportion for something that is in Plan 2040. We don't want walkable mixed-use neighborhoods that are compact and have businesses. I don't think that having a parking lot for every business is necessarily compatible with that. And I think it's a very kind of antiquated view of things, that everything needs to have all these cars show up at it. Like, how about more antiquated is that people did used to walk to stuff in their neighborhoods that was owned by their neighbors, the neighbors that may have lived upstairs on this. I mean, it's like a form that people just don't know anymore, because most people alive don't remember a time when that existed. But Lawrence's historic fabric was that.
So I remember that time. I absolutely remember that time. And I remember the time that East Lawrence tried to establish the neighborhood grocery store. And the problem was they were buying food from, what was the place at 23rd and Iowa?
Oh, a different one. I heard about the check.
No, that wasn't that grocery store, but they can't get deliveries,
Mhm.
right? So we're not gonna really get a neighborhood grocery store.
Do we need deliveries in
Very-
18-wheelers, or can we do a Sprinter van as is done in cities?
Can we do what?
A Sprinter van as is done in cities, because those definitely can work.
But
Even on a wide street.
that's not the same parking requirements, right? So it's very different to talk about restaurants than it is to talk about a hardware store or a lock shop or something else. So I like this idea of just reviewing the parking standards, and I would like to try to reduce them. I agree with that, but I don't want to say you can just come in because you happen to have industrial zoning and we're going to let you have a restaurant. And so you can take up all the parking on a street. You live in a place that has parking.
We can phase it out too when we
Yeah,
get a parking permit system. Okay, do you have another slide? I know we want to talk about administrative. I think Gary had something, Michael had something.
So this, excuse me, this slide is us looking through the major comments that we've seen in the consolidated draft. We wanted to start bringing back to you some of what we've seen in case there is a discussion to be had by steering committee. So the bottom bullet on here, many of the comments in the consolidated draft identify language that can be clarified or typos or express individual opinions, primarily about uses and dimensions. But there are some themes that are picked up a few places within the consolidated draft that we wanted to point out to you guys. First one is new development at the urban edge, which is a loose term. So new development that's going to take place in Lawrence as it goes outward in annexed areas should start at an R3 density. That was a suggestion. The idea is they should start at a density that is where the city wants to land, more or less, not at urban reserve. Second comment, and this came up in some of the neighborhood conversations also, sorry, to reconsider the role and impacts of the urban conservation overlay. So we had some neighborhood comments that they would like to be able to use the urban conservation overlay to more or less lock the neighborhood in place. So in lieu of covenants, this could serve that purpose. Alternatively, we know from our work in other communities that there are some communities that use very similar approach to fend off development in neighborhoods that could be subject to redevelopment or, you know, gentrification. So areas where there's more naturally occurring affordable housing are allowed to use a conservation district to hold the property in place. So that's that one. Third one was adding criteria that the public can see for when parking waivers or parking variances are issued, or sidewalk waivers or sidewalk variances are issued. This came up also in some of our neighborhood meetings, that there's decisions being made internally in the city that are likely made for good reasons, but it's opaque to the public why somebody got a parking variance and they can park on the street, or a sidewalk waiver and they don't have to put sidewalks in. And then finally, we have some comments in the ADUs to remove the owner occupancy requirement and increase the maximum percentage size that the ADU can be of the primary unit. So I know we're at 4:36 and you guys have some stuff you want to take up. We just wanted to put this stuff out to see if something you want to talk about at some point in time.
Okay, Gary, I know you have a really short one, because I know Michael has one.
A really short one. I just wanted to confirm, Elizabeth, I sent a mail not long ago about the line item that requires the planning commission to do or review a retail impact study on new retail items that are coming before the planning commission, that they remove from planning commission view, and that only lay with the city commission. I think I said that about the most complicated way I possibly could. Let me get my exact language here. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish what you're saying. Yeah.
The PC review criteria for rezoning has a requirement that if it's retail, we do a retail impact study. And we've had some discussion around that and feel like that should not be a planning commission function, that it should be a city commission function, a policy function.
Or multimodal. Step.
So my question about that, hold on, should be, okay. In going down the path of our last few slides, I think that we're going to end up with a steering committee recommendation and a planning commission recommendation. And I wasn't sure, we had some holdover questions from planning commission back to steering committee. And so I think we probably need to clear up whether or not steering committee wants to weigh in on the things that planning commission sent, or if you want to just leave that for planning commission. I'm not sure what your preference is.
Well, yeah, this request has been out there for a couple of months now. I've sent it several times in. Planning commission has heard this. I'm not saying that they won't change their mind, but I've heard this. I don't think this is an open question necessarily. Steering committee can certainly weigh in right now if they'd like, about whether or not, the question is, should the planning commission have as a part of its rezoning criteria the review of a retail impact study, and then approve whether or not we think that more retail is needed before we make a land use decision. My opinion is that we should not be thinking about policy of whether or not we have enough retail or what type of retail, but planning commission should be only about land use, and if it is something that the city wants, that this is an appropriate place for it to be.
Why isn't how much retail we need in the community a land use decision?
Land use is about where it goes, not if we should have it, largely.
Also about impact on the surrounding areas. It's not just whether that site might be suitable. It has to do with impacts. That's what the retail studies are about.
But if we bring this in, all of a sudden, the planning commission is going to be dealing with things way beyond, do we want Trader Joe's here in town? The subjectivity that brings away from just the pure criteria that we have for making a rezoning decision, I think takes policy away from the city.
Can I also just point of clarification that it wouldn't kick in for any rezoning for retail? It's if an application that proposes to create more than 100,000 square feet of retail. So just want to make sure that that clarification was noted.
Still, in my view,
Yeah.
planning commission is, should not have that policy function. That's my view.
We just put forward for consideration on that one, that would be a different item that city commission would review that the planning commission would not. So there may be some incongruent reviews occurring between what the planning commission's recommendation would be and what the city commission would have there. And I worry about that and I don't know if that's the.
Is that the 100,000, now that you said the 100,000, is that what's in our code now?
Yes.
The 100,000, so that's been in our code. Okay,
And there since the second.
but yeah, exactly, but it hasn't, we didn't reduce or change that. Okay, well, I think for now, let's leave that in this draft, because that's what's in our current code, and we can talk about that. Hey, Michael.
A couple things on administrative, but before I do this first bullet point there, Elizabeth, I don't know if that's a typo, but the proposal was for M3. I mean, we could entertain R3 as well, but M3 would be more mixed use. Just to set the stage that we want new development, greenfield, to be guided towards mixed use. So anyway, that was just a clarification. On administrative, first of all, the two things, let's have a discussion about your proposal or your question. Should the appeal period be extended from 9 days to 14 days? And as I had met with Brad about this once, and we had talked about a couple of things that maybe these kind of decisions could go on consent agenda and be dealt with if necessary, but Brad preferred to have a date. And the number that we talked about, but it was just an idea at the time, was 30 days. Yet I don't find 14 days adequate. From the point of view of the neighborhood, when we get notification, the clock starts ticking from the date of the letter. So 3 days later, the neighborhood president might get a letter. It's 6 days remaining. They have to take time over a weekend or whatever to contact the neighborhood. The neighborhood gets back. The 9 days are gone. 14 days isn't going to accomplish a whole lot more. And I think 30 days is better yardstick. So we could talk about that one and I could go into the second one.
Yeah, let's talk about that one.
Okay.
Thoughts from other people? How many do we get, Jeff, appeals?
Not frequently, but that would mean every site plan would be stalled 30 days because we'd have to wait the appeal window out.
That's definitely the trade-off, is you're trying to get things built quicker,
Right,
and 30 days makes it more expensive because you
right.
can't get your building permit.
But this isn't necessarily, certainly not every time going to be appealed.
Yeah.
It's just an
But
option.
you have to wait.
But
You
every-
can't issue the building permit till the appeal time runs, so it.
Yes, you could build in something like the appellate court, a notice of intent that could trigger a little extra time. So if you get, the neighborhood president gets it, they know that this is an issue in their neighborhood. They need time to schedule that meeting and they give, we're gonna have this meeting, and you give them a little extra time to get their meeting and get something in. And that doesn't apply to everything. That's just that individual one.
My only concern with that is I could see somebody just always filing that.
Just doing
intent
it
and never
every
following
time.
through.
There is.
There are communities that do have that. That is the process. They just file the intent and never process out. But I think that's a possibility too. Just throwing that out as something I've seen in the past.
Well, I mean, maybe everybody has different perspective, but personally, I don't feel the whole point of the code is to fast track everything. We want to streamline it, we want to facilitate it, but we also want it to be equitable with, the back and forth with the neighborhood.
But I also think we were trying to get affordable, and,
Yes.
if someone
And
has
every
money.
time we try to do that, the neighborhood takes an
Yeah.
issue with a stigma that,
But if they
often
have-
doesn't exist. And so I think just so then we're kind of counting on that 30 days you know, whether we've talked to the neighborhood or not, it gives them that. I mean, I like more talking about, I don't know, I really like trying to talk to the neighborhood and give them information ahead of time, but not stalling that process by 30 days.
Well, what about 21 days? How that fly?
I just think
Do you-
it's used sometimes with the worst of intentions.
Do you have examples that in the 9 days that someone wanted to appeal and is that a theoretical problem or you've seen it happen more?
I can't recall
than
the
one.
particular instances, but over the years in my neighborhood, and in these cases, there were site plans.
Yeah.
So I can't recall particulars. But, you know, it was a scramble to get everybody, first of all, up to speed and have a meeting and try to make a decision and get back with a response.
Is there anything that could be done as a part of upfront notification that informs people of timelines and what's available to them? As opposed to the clock starting at X, start the clock at the very beginning of a notification process.
Yeah, there's a way to do that. This kind of segues into my second issue with administrative, and that has to do with the neighborhood engagement meetings, which right now it requires theoretically a developer to meet with the neighborhood early on, kind of like what you're talking about, as a conversational thing. It's not any requirement that comes out of that, but just to engage with the neighborhood. Right now, it's written up, required only for preliminary development plans. If that were expanded to include rezonings and special use permits, which I think, Elizabeth, I think you added special use permits to that. And then maybe major site plans.
I'm looking.
If these meetings were held early on in the process, it might obviate, you know, a conflict later down the road. So that maybe is an option. I don't know. Where in the code is that, Elizabeth? About the neighborhood?
It's table 20-16-3 today. When the new draft goes up, that might be renumbered. Right now, it's only required for preliminary development plan for PUD.
Didn't you have a question about adding special use permits?
We talked
where
about
did
it and we didn't have consensus to do that.
Oh, because I saw that somewhere, but, so anyway, my neighborhood and LAN is proposing that be expanded. Just FYI, that's the position that we've taken.
And remind me, we had this discussion early on, when is that required in the process?
Early. I don't know if
Oh, I
that's
know.
specified yet.
I'm asking what it says.
And most of the time it is done prior to filing the application.
That's our current process. We're just carrying that forward for the preliminary development.
Yeah.
They have to, as part of their application, show that they've had that.
So I could see maybe going with the 14 days if we have this other engagement opportunity early on, that might work out.
And I think the discussion before was the concern of having those meetings and no one showing up. You know, that you have a required meeting, no one shows up for where you have it, that sort of thing, but
And, you know, just so early in the process.
yeah, you know, how much to say.
And
What do we know?
that varies neighborhood to neighborhood. My neighborhood would show up,
Mhm.
you know, West Hills, maybe not. I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand the correlation between requiring a neighborhood meeting and isn't the 9 days on appeal of an administrative decision?
Yes.
So those are different things.
Good point.
Actually, you're right, yeah.
You're about different,
Directly related.
Good point.
Because the 9 days is an administrative decision.
Yeah,
Jeff is-
That's right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry for confusing the issue. So back to the 9 or 14 days. Last number there I threw out was 21 days. Which I think would be adequate for my neighborhood. Some neighborhoods aren't as organized as much, but
Yeah, I'm concerned with the vast number we have that never get appealed and never are concerned to be appealed, that we just slow down the whole thing. You know, we lose 4 or 5 days with not. So I might be interested. Personally, I'd rather leave this at 9, but I like that Jim's idea of maybe having a process where you could get some additional time.
Had to be a reasonable basis for asking for additional.
We have to think about that.
So you have to come up with.
So I think for the purposes of this draft, let's leave it at 9. Unless other people, I mean, I know you went 14, but this is a strong move, but I think let's think about a process like that. And I don't know, Elizabeth, if you've ever seen that anywhere else, if there's language you've seen. Okay.
I understand the concept. I haven't seen it in a zoning code. So I think all of the considerations are valid that we're throwing around here. We haven't heard this from a lot of other places. I think we heard it in 2 neighborhood meetings. So I understand what Michael's saying, that it's hard to get everyone together, but I don't know if we're solving a smaller problem or creating a bigger problem. So let's leave it like this and come back to it.
Yeah, let's leave it. Those agree, leave it at that for now, but let's talk about that, see if there's, come up with something different. If that's, I know this, because this question, do we want to change the required meeting in this draft? Again, Land has asked us to have that for rezoning, special use permits, major site plans and preliminary development plans. Right now, it's only preliminary development plans. We'll leave the draft as is and see what people say.
Does everything
Make a change.
just already require a public meeting?
They all require public meetings.
Yeah.
They just don't, but you don't.
Not current. I don't, if I've understood correctly, it was rezoning, special use, major site plan and preliminary development.
Yeah.
Major site plan would not have a public meeting because those are typically an administrative application.
Okay.
Took a second to catch up on all the.
Thank you.
I'm comfortable with everything that already requires public process. Where I feel a little bit funny about required public meeting is for anything that's allowed by right.
So I think we're talking 2 different things. You're talking initial public meeting, right?
the neighborhood outreach.
And Jeff, you're talking like a planning commission public meeting.
Yeah, I think I may have misunderstood that.
Yeah.
Commissioner Rego's question was.
I was talking about having an initial outreach meeting where there's a public.
Yeah, so what Brad had listed, none of those things require an initial public meeting with the neighborhood at this time.
No, not at this time.
Right, what I'm saying is,
It's suggested that we do have the outreach meetings with the neighborhood for the preliminary development plan. Land is asking that also include rezoning, special use permit.
Site plans, and text amendments. You're saying the compromise would be just the ones that require a public hearing.
I'm saying if it's part of public hearing, then yes.
Meaning planning commission, city commission, not administrators.
Yeah.
So Gary, you're saying if there is a public hearing, then do not have a public outreach meeting?
No, I'm saying if it is an item that has that
will eventually show up at the planning commission, have a neighborhood meeting.
the neighborhood meeting as a part of the process leading up to that makes sense. Just one guy, it makes sense to me. Consistent with a lot of feedback that I've heard, where I struggle with anything not that, and particularly things that are by right requiring a neighborhood outreach. Because you want great neighbors, you want, be able to talk, but if they don't really have any input beyond just listening, I struggle with why do
The
it.
point from the neighborhood's perspective is that, it could reduce the potential for future conflict, that if everybody understands what's being proposed, and it's not necessarily going to be agreed, but if you have initial discussion and a conversation and a dialogue, maybe some of the rough edges could be removed and it might be more palatable, maybe not. but at least it's an opportunity.
I completely support it, but where the public process is in place.
Have those thoughts? Rebecca, Phil, people who do this more?
Yeah, I mean, a few neighborhoods, we get good information so frequently. It's so early in the process. I mean, what do we have to share, right? Because we haven't made a submittal yet. It's not public information.
And you won't be held to it either.
No, I get all that,
Yeah.
you know. But there is the frustration level of, okay, I can't tell you, but, you know, we're gonna annex this piece of ground and
It's a very real thing. Michael, I got a call today about Holcomb. And I, was saying, I'm not trying to be difficult. I do not know what we're going to do with that yet. I have no information, but we will, as a best practice, we'll be inviting the neighborhood. But sometimes demanding that at a point where we don't have any information to share just honestly makes the neighborhood think we're hiding things when we're not. We just don't know yet.
when we end up doing it just to meet a requirement.
Right, and then that adds cost but doesn't really get to the solution you're trying to get to of good communication with the neighborhood. That's definitely in my case, because affordable housing can't spend all the money until we're a little further down the road.
I think it would work the other way around, that if people feel they're being talked with and listened to, they're not going to feel like things are being kept secret.
I love that idea. It's never been my experience that's happened.
More of an adversarial situation now.
Well, let me ask this question. Why is it, I mean, your concern is it's before the application, you might not know anything. What about between the application and the public hearing?
Yeah,
Yeah, now you have something to talk about. You have the application there.
I guess when I was saying, I assumed that was the case.
Yeah, but this would, so if it's sometime between the application and the public hearing,
Yes,
doing the review part, or
Yes.
within 60, within 40, how long is the review? Within 45 days of the application, you have a meeting.
Typically, the normal planning commission window runs about a 60-day from between when you submit for demo and when you land on it, it's about 60 days.
So what about within 45 days of the application, you have a public?
Yeah.
You have a meeting with the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's the best practice. I mean, tenants don't tries to do that. Michael, it hasn't always created
But
good
at least then you have
intention,
something.
but trying it, I think, and saying that's what we're gonna do.
Whatever Elizabeth drew up, I don't know what the time frame was that you were talking about. We're
Elizabeth,
just talking about the activity.
what was, the proposal you had was preliminary development plans as a pre-application or post-application? I was thinking it's
It's,
pre-application.
right now, it's pre-application, so we can change it to post-application. That's fine. What if, when, we did hear concerns, as we got the project going about, developers scheduling public meetings and having nobody show up for it.
Yeah.
And there were a few different things that were tossed out about that. What if the applicant has to offer a public meeting, and if there's no response from the neighborhood association or the neighborhood, they don't have to have it?
Yes.
That's fair, because that's what we experienced a couple of times too.
The problem is, you don't know. I mean, we go in there and we'll sit in the school cafeteria and give them, 15 minutes to show up. If nobody shows up, we get up and
But
leave.
if you do know,
You have to make an email offer. If it's not taken up, you don't have to schedule a meeting. You don't have to show up and wait for them to come.
That would be protocols that we can do,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, if there's some way to do that, that would be,
Yeah,
but right now, the practice is we show up, we just.
if you have somebody to send that email to. some neighborhoods, who do you identify? You know, that,
If the neighborhoods don't have somebody to identify, that's their issue.
Yeah.
not-
Like that. I like putting that on the neighborhoods.
I think there needs to be a receipt confirmation,
yes.
like the.
They receive-
The neighborhoods,
Yeah.
yeah, like the associations have asked to say they received it. Make sure it wasn't sent to the wrong email or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can work out the details on that.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, other, mostly,
We talked about one thing, Gary and I, that was sort of fun that I think we passed over when we talked about the parking requirements. And that was to say, what do we do within so many feet of a bus stop, within so many feet of access to the Lawrence Loop? Those are the places that we really want to talk about developing more dense housing and may not need parking. So I think somehow we have to also encourage development in a place that people can take advantage of other transportation alternatives.
At one point, the code said within a quarter mile of a bus stop, there was no required parking. I don't know if it still says that or.
And maybe a quarter mile is too far.
Yeah.
But,
That's pretty standard, I think.
but
Yeah, we
That's
assume people
basically-
will walk a quarter mile.
That's basically a 15-minute walk.
a 15-minute walk is, if you had buses like they work in London, where if you don't get there, 10 minutes later, another bus comes.
Yeah.
But that's not what we have in Lawrence. So I think we should be talking about less than a 10-minute walk. But so is that still there after the change in the parking requirements?
The only,
Yeah,
the
I
only
think so.
question I have with that is
Go ahead.
that bus stops are not necessarily fixed.
Yeah.
And they move them and with new, especially edge development, they're looking at, okay, where in this can we put a bus stop? And they may relocate one from somewhere else. So, you know, that's not a fixed destination all the time, all spots.
Yeah, but once it gets very dense development, it will be, it's more likely that it'll be.
well, let's put that on the think about list.
I would like that on the think about list,
Yeah.
because I do want to say, how do we match up convenience with these changes in parking?
And recognize the existence of infrastructure that supports no parking.
Okay. Any last things? Okay, Elizabeth, you good?
We need your, some feedback from you guys on how we want to handle moving forward with the steering committee recommendations. So tomorrow, we're gonna post that July 19th draft. And the goal is to have a report from the steering committee, and there will be separate action by the planning commission. And so we want to start with the July 19th version as the baseline, and we will identify any specific edits that steering committee wants to see. So this stuff, as we come back to it, we'll say we want to edit, table 2012-2 in this manner. We have 2 meetings left. And so we may be doing some work, either outside of a meeting, following up or whatever. So we wanted to talk about a couple things. First off, how does the group want to make sure that the changes reflect the entire steering committee's preference? We, have been talking about different things over different times. And so we can do that a couple ways. We can make sure that we tee them all up to discuss at one of the next 2 meetings, in which case we may work with the group in agenda setting before the meeting, or we can post-meeting, do some surveying and see where the majority vote comes in from the group. So just to make sure that the report reflects the committee. And then we think based on the steering committee's meetings, we will have your draft report to you by September 30th. Excuse me. It's a little close to the October 15th date that I believe City Commission wants to do a workshop. But it allows us a little time after your last meeting, so we will crank on it to get it out, and hopefully we can get it turned to the City Commission as quickly as possible following that.
So that September 30 meeting is intended to have all planning commission feedback, everything
Yeah.
in the final version, or?
No, that's the steering committee. That's not, the planning commission's gonna vote on yours on September 25th.
Right, what I'm saying is that draft, is that going to be updated with recommendation for plan, or they're always going to be two separate things from this point on?
I think it's gonna be two separate things from this
Alright.
point on, and that's what I'm trying to get some clarity about. Is that how we want to do this?
So I'm sort of a little confused about why we would have two separate tracks, because we have a planning commission that's responsible for making the recommendations to the city commission, so this.
Well, under the theory, they would, as the applicant, first of all, the city commission directed us to help bring something forward.
Right.
I mean, let's say the planning commission says, never mind, we don't want to make any changes to the zoning code. We want to be able to say, no, we like the idea of changing the zoning code. I mean, or if they.
Do you want to work around the planning
Well,
commission?
because we're the applicant, yeah. I mean, if they say, for example, we don't want mixed-use zoning at all. We want to keep the zoning as it exists. They can say that.
And it's up to the
The question is,
city commission to say, no, you're
Yeah.
not doing
yeah,
that.
But
well-
it's not up to the,
well,
Okay.
the ordinance, we created this committee to give a recommendation to the city commission on what the zoning code should look like.
okay,
That's what we asked this committee to do. The planning commission will do their, I mean, you know, they have to do theirs, they're gonna do theirs too. But I guess,
So how does it get challenged in court?
what do you mean has a challenge?
Because you've got a vote at the planning commission, that's established by statute, the way that goes with recommendations, and that has weight in court proceedings. Where does this recommendation fit in?
Well,
If somebody out there says, this is.
Well, it's just like a staff report. The staff report can go to the planning commission and the staff report can say, we think there should be 5 parking spots.
Yeah.
The planning commission says, no, we think there should be 6 parking. What goes to the city commission?
All of it.
The staff report, that's it. This is the staff report. The steering committee reports the staff report. And then there's the planning commission report. I don't see what's confusing about
The
that.
steering committee recommendations away from the deliberations of the planning commission.
I think the steering committee should present to the planning commission as a body, and then that's part of the record. And the city commission can look at that as part of the record.
Okay, so
right?
hold up, time out. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
Nope, I'm sorry, Gabby, can you go back to the calendar? Go back to the calendar slide. I apologize. I thought I copied it in again. Okay, so we're also trying to work within city commission's recommendations for how long this process should last. So if we, are you guys ready to wrap right now and give your recommendations to planning commission? I think that there are still some open issues. Because, so that's why we set up the parallel tracks here, to get everything to come together in early October in front of the city commission.
And the planning commission, last steering committee meeting is before the designed decision for planning commission, so it does feed into that
Okay.
all along the way.
But the draft, isn't the draft report after the last planning commission meeting? Am I missing, or am I misinterpreting?
Yes, but that's the report, but we're not gonna meet between the time. So we won't know when we do our final report, we don't know we won't know what the planning commission does. Because our last meeting's September 19th, the report's on the 30th. They'll meet in between those two.
Yeah.
So they will, I mean, the planning commission will have, we'll have our report. And of course, they'll have our report, our final report.
Yep.
And then.
Yep.
Then the planning commission will take their action and we won't meet again to change that. We won't be reacting to the planning commission, but that gives us time to give our final report.
So what is the process of our decision? They mentioned something about a survey or something?
Well, I mean, we haven't, yeah, the question is, are we gonna take like a vote? Like a survey vote, either in the meeting while people are here? You have to be here to vote? Or is it a survey after the fact to all the, in case you miss the next meeting? Do you get a chance to vote on it after the meeting by survey? I think that's what she's asking. Or is
Yeah,
it
that's a,
consensus of the
and
people here?
the way you guys handled it today, we wouldn't need to do that. You've worked through everything in front of you. So that's simply a backup option, and it's honestly not the best backup option.
And my earliest question of the meeting, is it simply an up-down vote on the whole code? Yes or no?
No, we're just looking to make sure that we understand where the group is on recommending individual issues. Should anything come up that we don't get resolved as a group. If you guys want to, you have not been asked to vote yes or no on anything in terms of the code. I'm not sure that that would be super beneficial to the group. If you have things that you don't like about it, you are still welcome to make comments to Planning Commission or turn them in individually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, a little over time. We'll take this up in the next meeting and see where we're at. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Get better, Elizabeth.
Working on it. Thank you.